Mideast Realities, a unique half-hour highlighting the real Middle East. It is a program of information that government and media often misrepresent or just don't want you to know. Get the news without bias. Facts without distortion. And most importantly, analysis from the experts. With your host and chairman of the Committee on the Middle East, Mertv Sd. Each week, this program will feature an interview, discussion, or an event to help viewers understand the complex situation in today's Middle East, and especially the realities of U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world. Mideast Realities.
Welcome to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski. For the past couple of weeks, we've been bringing you the views of Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Aarons. Not because he's a favorite of ours, not because we agree with his views, but because he's a very important man. He's been the defense minister, the foreign minister, the ambassador to the United States, and most importantly, Bibi Netanyahu is his protege. It was he, Moshe Aarons, who spotted Bibi Netanyahu, who brought him into politics, who brought him to the United Nations, and who catapulted him to become the Prime Minister of Israel. A number of years ago, speaking here in Washington at Adass Israel Synagogue, Moshe Aarons was far more candid than normal. He thought he was in retirement. Rabin was the Prime Minister. He expected Likud to come back to power, but he didn't expect himself to come back to power, and that's why we've been showing you his very candid views. He gave a talk, as I said, at the Adass Israel Synagogue. The last couple of programs featured highlights from that talk, and this week we'll be concluding with the question and answer period in which he further, rather candidly, explains his ideological outlook. And at the end of the program, I'll give you our own perspective and take on these, and we'll show you a clip from Moshe Aarons' son, Yigal, who holds about the opposite views of he. The irony, as I've said before, that the defense minister of Israel's son never served in the Israeli army and by American standards would be considered something of a draft dodger. All right, the question and answer period from the talk that the defense minister of Israel gave in Washington a number of years ago.
Holds a right and suppose Likud comes roaring back. Aren't you caught, as democracies sometimes are, between a rock and a hard place? In other words, you have commitments now. This government has made commitments. Gaza is turned over already. Jericho is. There are commitments to keep withdrawing on the West Bank. And as far as I understand, every Israeli government is bound by the commitments of its many predecessors. So suppose Likud comes back. Well, what could you do about, what is it called these days, land for peace, territorial compromise, whatever? Could you change it?
I think that as regards the commitments that have been made so far, there is really no insoluble problem that the Likud would face, because the Oslo agreement made with the PLO specifies that negotiations for the permanent status of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza will be held at a time which turns out to be in the calendar, the election time in November of 1996. And it is really only in these negotiations that the kind of commitments could be made that in terms of adherence to international commitments would be irreversible. So as far as that's concerned, and since nobody, I would add in his right mind, thinks of returning to Gaza, I would say no irreparable or terminal damage, in my view, has been done. The area of concern is the Golan Heights. If the Arabian government were to sign an international agreement with the Syrian dictator abandoning the Golan Heights, that would be the kind of international commitment that maybe a different government would not find itself capable of going back on, regardless of how it disagreed. And my own personal nightmare has been throughout this past year, these past months, that I would open the paper one morning and find that that agreement has been signed. Because there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that despite Rabin's campaign promises, that he would not abandon the Golan Heights. As a matter of fact, he said anybody that abandons the Golan Heights is risking the very security of the state of Israel. There's no doubt in my mind that a clear message has been sent to Damascus and to Washington that the Arabian government is prepared to abandon all of the Golan Heights. They have some subsidiary requirements about the schedule of withdrawal and about the elements of the peaceful relations that need to be established, but the agreement in principle is there, and the only reason that an agreement has not been signed is because Assad has evidently not been ready to make the right moves and to smile in the right direction. Here we could have a problem area, but so far the agreement has not been signed, and I was a little encouraged to hear from Mr. Peres, who was on the airplane with me, that he thought the outlook was not very promising. And I was glad to hear that.
You are speaking. You are speaking. You and Mr. Peres, having read your book.
Oh yes.
Well, you're not going to find that tomorrow morning unless something's going on in Oslo that we don't know about on the Golan Heights. But the die is cast, isn't it, on the Palestinians? I mean, your and Mr. Shamir's hopes to find a new Palestinian leadership, some alternative to the PLO. The PLO was on the ropes, but indeed this government revived the PLO, revived Yasser Arafat. There's no turning back from that, is there?
I'm not sure that that's the case, because it's not at all clear that Yasser Arafat could get elected in free and democratic elections amongst the Palestinian population. He's certainly facing a great deal of opposition from many directions, by the way, not only from the Muslim fundamentalists, but also from many Palestinian intellectuals who have assimilated, maybe some superficially, the norms that govern Israeli society, who have seen a democratic system at work, who have seen the free press, who have seen respect for civil liberties, and they don't like what they see when they look at Arafat's leadership. I don't think Arafat is very eager to hold elections. As a matter of fact, I understand that whatever elections in quotation marks are being discussed are not going to be elections for his position. He considers that already assured. He doesn't feel that he needs a mandate from the people. But my own prognosis is that he is not a permanent fixture out there as leader of the Palestinian population. What will come in instead? I don't know. My thesis has always been and continues to be that we must negotiate with people who have a mandate from the Palestinian population. And when somebody says to me, well, whoever will be elected in true elections, maybe even worse than Arafat, maybe Hamas, maybe Muslim fundamentalists, I'll say, so be it. If it turns out that the majority of the population does not want peace with Israel, then we're not going to solve anything by signing an agreement with somebody who doesn't represent that majority. Nothing will come of it anyway.
Thank you. Our final panelist, and we'll have more than three questions, of course, is John Joshko. John has been a reporter for the Post for more years than needs to be related. He spent 11 of those years as a foreign correspondent, and he headed the Post's first bureau in Washington in the 1970s. He was the Post diplomatic reporter for 18 years, covering the work of the Secretary of State and other foreign policy figures and issues. He has focused principally on the Arab-Israel conflict in his work as a correspondent in the Middle East. I'm sure he has many questions also.
Yeah, Mr. Minister or Mr. Ahrens, I'd like to pursue a point where you left off with your last answer. Assume arguendo, as lawyers say, that you have an election in Israel and the Likud is returned to power. Now, what would, you said in part that your response of the Likud government would be to negotiate with people who are representative through elections that they are. But what would be the Likud's position in dealing with them? One of the fundamental differences that you have had between the Likud, which is my understanding of all the conversations that I've had with you and other members of the bloc, is that in some not yet specifically defined way, the West Bank, or Gaza and Judea and Samaria, should be permanently associated with Israel. Whereas the United States position has been, ever since 1967, that a solution should be predicated on the land for peace, swapping territory for peace with the Arab world. How would you, this time around, how would the Likud attempt to bridge the gulf between U.S. policy and its basic position?
Well, the question, as far as we're concerned, is really not only bridging the gulf between U.S. policy and our policy, but one of addressing in an effective manner the problem that we in Israel face. And I, as foreign minister, as just a plain Israeli, have frequently been angered and frustrated when people from other countries, including the United States, preach to me the importance of making peace in the area. Nobody wants peace more than Israel. It may be important for the United States to have a peaceful Middle East, but I think nobody will argue that it's far more important for Israel. We have paid the highest price of all for the absence of peace, with the lives of our sons. And if peace has not been achieved in the 46 years of Israel, 48 years of Israel's existence, it's not been for lack of trying. It's been because of Arab aggression. And we continue to try, and I think we're making progress, and we'll continue to make progress. But that's really the problem that we face. It's one that I think needs to be looked at, and justifiably so, in terms of our perspective, and not in terms of what other people are urging us to do. Now, as regards the question itself, let me first address two that are relatively easy to address as regards the Likud's position, and then go on to the one that is far more difficult, and I think it's important to understand that it is difficult. There's no easy solution and no shortcut. As regards the Golan Heights, I think I've already stated my position. I think it would be utter folly on the part of Israel to give up control of this so important strategic position that overlooks the northern part of Israel. As many of you in the audience probably know, and certainly as everyone in the panel knows, since 1967, that's now 27 years, every important visitor to Israel was taken up to the Golan Heights in order to be shown, in order that he should see with his own eyes that this was an area that was absolutely essential to Israel's security and that Israel could not give up. And invariably, maybe with very few exceptions, even some high officials of the U.S. administration who made that trip, some refused to make the trip, would say after seeing for themselves, don't give up an inch. This is an area that we really cannot afford to give up. You may have heard that the Israeli foreign minister, now under Mr. Peres' stewardship, has recently given instructions that visitors are not to be taken to the Golan Heights anymore. So on that, I say that's a concession that we should not make. And if the Syrian dictator will not make peace with us unless we do make that concession, I say so be it. The Israeli border with Syria has been a quiet border ever since 1967, and it's been a quiet border because Assad knows how strong Israel is, and that any attempt by him to start a war would lead to his defeat. Not because he has or does not have an agreement, but because he respects, or because he has a certain perception of Israeli strength, which may change for the worse if we lose control over the Golan Heights. The second issue that I think is relatively easy to address, certainly for me, and I think for most Israelis, is the Gaza Strip. I say good riddance to bad rubbish. It's a good thing we're out of there. We don't need it. It's not of great strategic importance to Israel. There are 1 million Palestinians living there in squalor under terrible conditions, a breeding ground for terrorism. It's not a problem that we can solve. If the international community of nations, if the Arab countries that have money like Saudi Arabia realize that this is a problem that needs to be attended to, they should go at it. It's not something that we can handle. And I think that sooner or later, even the present Israeli government will come to the conclusion that they must seal off that area, and that with all the goodwill that we may have to help the economy of the Palestinian population living in Gaza, and the particular interest that Mr. Rabin and Paris have to shore up Yasser Arafat in Gaza by helping him economically, the population of Israel simply will not be prepared to risk the lives of our civilians in the center of our cities or on our buses in order to provide economic assistance to the Palestinian population there. So that presumably is the easy part. Nothing in the Middle East is easy. But as compared to the third element, and I think probably that's the one that you addressed, and that's the future of Judea and Samaria. And that's hard. That's hard. And I would preface whatever I want to say on the subject by something that I think is important to recall and nevertheless frequently forgotten. Not all problems have solutions. As a matter of fact, I think that probably the list of problems in this world that have no solutions is considerably longer than the list of problems that have solutions. That's true in mathematics, but maybe especially true when it comes to human relations and the relations between peoples and the resolution of conflicts. So starting with an assumption that here's a problem, and it is, in this case, the problem of the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria, and all we need to do is to identify that solution, and if we haven't done so, then there's something wrong with us. And if we don't accept some suggestion as being the appropriate solution, then there's something wrong with that. With us, I think, is a basic mistake. There is a almost intractable problem here, in the sense that in Judea and Samaria there are today living 1 million Palestinians. Also, by the way, 140,000 Jews. They represent more than 10% of the population. They travel the roads daily. The children are being bused to school daily. Aside from the 140,000 Israelis who live in the area, hundreds of thousands of Israelis travel through the area for one reason or another. Everybody that travels from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on the main highway passes over the Green Line, whether he knows it or not, or enters the territory of Samaria. Anybody who takes the alternate northern route, which today is a superhighway, just like the main highway, goes 80% of the time through Samaria. And this territory, unlike Gaza, lies right in the heart and guts of Israel. It is essential, in my view, to the very security of Israel. It borders on the population centers of Israel, on Jerusalem, on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. The meaning of this, by the way, is becoming very clear even to the Rabin government, in the sense that they don't seem to be prepared at this time to implement the second step of the Oslo Agreement, namely doing in Judea and Samaria what they did in Gaza, pulling out the Israeli army or redeploying the Israeli army and turning it over to the PLO police force in quotation marks. Hardly anybody in Israel is prepared today to envisage the implementation of that, because they're not prepared to envisage the predictable consequences of that happening. So what do you do with a situation where the control over the area is essential to Israel's security? Nevertheless, there are 1 million Palestinians living in the area who are not citizens of Israel, who don't want to be citizens of Israel, and who most Israelis do not want to be citizens of Israel. I have no quick solutions to that. I think it's a problem that needs to be worked, with attention being given to the plight of the Palestinian population, to their aspirations, but in no way neglecting the security needs of the State of Israel. Some indication of the lack of answers in the Paris Rabin camp has come from Mr. Rabin himself these last few weeks. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Rabin, in what seems to me an act of desperation, has begun to talk about separation. Separation between Jews and Arabs. After the Bet Lid incident, an incident in which 21 young Israelis were killed. By the way, an incident that was met by jubilation by masses of people in Gaza. Mr. Rabin appeared on Israeli television and said, what we need is separation, Afradah. Separate the Jews from the Arabs. Well, it can't be done. He may have addressed some inner feelings in most Israelis who feel that they would be more secure if Arabs were not walking the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. That we have 800,000 Arabs living in Israel itself who are citizens of the State of Israel. We have 170,000 Arabs living in Jerusalem. Mr. Rabin is obviously not suggesting that Jerusalem be divided between a Jewish Jerusalem and an Arab Jerusalem. However, he said we have 140,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria. Does he want to transfer out Arabs? Does he want to transfer out Jews? I don't think he has seriously addressed the question. I don't think he seriously means to implement it, but it's just an indication of just how difficult the problem is that we're grappling with. So I'm sorry if I'm not giving you a definite solution to this problem. I don't have a definite solution to this problem. As an Israeli, as a former defense minister, I feel I must pay attention first and foremost, not only, but first and foremost, to the security of the State of Israel and the people who live in Israel.
Such are the views of Moshe Ahrens, and in fact they're very important views. They were given at a time when he thought he was in retirement, when he did not expect to come back to political power, and thus they're much more candid than normal. The other important thing to always remember about Moshe Ahrens, who served as defense minister, foreign minister, and ambassador to the United States, is that Bibi Netanyahu is his responsibility. He was the one who spotted him, who made him his protege, who gave him his political start, and who is thus responsible for him. And sure enough, Moshe Ahrens is quite right, although we normally don't agree with him on very much, that there is no simple or easy solution anymore to the Palestinian problem. No division, no state. The situation is far too complicated with bypass roads and settlements and areas A, B, and C and all kinds of agreements. It was done this way on purpose to make it impossible for the Palestinians to ever have real self-determination like the Israelis have, and to so confuse the situation that it's very difficult for even experts to talk about it now. The important situation in the territories is that the Israeli settlements have continued to expand. The bypass roads are being built all over. The disenfranchisement has continued. The policy of putting the Palestinians on modern-day reservations and Bantustans has gone forward. But that's Mideast realities, and that's why we have this program. Before we conclude, we'd like to show you a clip of Moshe Ahrens' son, who has diametrically opposed views to those of his father, who believes that U.S. aid should be cut to Israel, who believes in a real Palestinian state, and who in fact refused to serve in the Israeli army that his father commands. So let's show you a clip of Yigal Ahrens, and then I'll come back to conclude the program.
The question being, why do I think that, or does JCOM think that U.S. aid to Israel should be reduced? And the answer to that is that the Israelis make no secret of the fact that there are really two answers. One answer is that is pretty much the primary power that the U.S. has over Israel. We're working in the United States trying to get our government here to change its ways in a manner that will bring about a more positive outcome in the Middle East, I think. And this is one of the primary powers that the U.S. government holds over Israel. But specifically, if we look at what the aid was used for, so what was done with the aid, then we see that this aid in amounts that make it look almost like the Israelis are doing so intentionally, is actually used to build settlements, to increase the control that Israel has over the occupied territories, and to make an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories essentially impossible, or as impossible as the Israelis can make it. I think that's just a disaster in the making. I think the only way that peaceful and normal relations between the Israelis and Palestinians in that area will ever come about is if the Palestinians get to have an independent state in which they can determine their own fate, and the Israelis are left in their own state.
Whatever the terminology, whatever the declarations, most of us involved with Mideast realities believe the Palestinians are further away from independence and sovereignty now than before this quote-unquote peace process began. Realities on the ground are far more important than realities by declaration. Nevertheless, the situation is fluid, is unstable, is confusing, is difficult to understand even for the experts, and that's why we have this program, Mideast Realities. That's why we hope you'll continue to tune in. We'd like your support, we'd like your comments, we'd like your help. It's very easy to get in touch with us. We have a 24-hour number at 202-362-5266. And in the Washington area, we hold regular meetings, and we'd very much like to hear from you. We also have a website at www.middleeast.org, and there's a great deal of information there about the complex Mideast realities taking place, not only in the Palestinian arena, but also in dealing with Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the client regimes that the United States has sponsored in the region. So thank you very much for tuning in, and please do so next week. I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for Mideast Realities.